All right, so welcome everyone to Module 3A. And I'm calling Module 3A Optimizing Memory because it reviews and supplements Chapter 6 of your text, which talks a lot about effective study strategies and other ways you can make it easier to get information into long-term memory, so to encode information, to storage information or store information or maintain it long-term, and also to retrieve it. So I would call all of those processes together kind of optimizing your memory system or making it most efficient in order for you to successfully learn information. Okay? So what we're going to talk about in this particular video are the benefits of memory retrieval in terms of it as a mechanism for optimizing memory. Okay, so we're going to talk a lot about retrieval practice. Okay, but before we get started with our discussion of memory retrieval as a method of optimizing your memory performance, I always start off these sorts of discussions with information that I get from students. So one of the things that I like to do with my introductory psychology students when they're first in Psych 101 is I like to ask them what are some common study strategies that they like to employ. And a lot of times I get things like this. So a lot of students will say that they like to, before an exam, they like to read the textbook chapter maybe several different times, or to read over their notes again several different times. They also talk about how they like to do practice tests, but they stipulate that these are typically practice tests that are given to them or provided for them. So perhaps something in the back of their textbook or something that their professor creates. A lot of students also admit to cramming for exams, and they say that that is the study strategy or study schedule, that they're most likely to adopt, right? So for example, instead of studying for 1 hour, 8 days prior to an exam, a lot of students said they would be more likely to study for 8 hours the night before the exam. Similarly, a lot of students said that they preferred to study in one place, right? So maybe they had a favorite little nook in the library, or maybe they were always careful to study in their bedroom or study in the classroom where most of their courses were, and so on, but they always had one particular spot that they preferred to study in. Okay. And 80% of the Psych 101 students who were asked this question endorsed it as being true, and that is the question, if I learn in just the right way, learning will be easy, right? So how many respondents were asked, or the people I gave this survey to were asked, do you agree with the statement, yes or no? And 80% of the sample said yes. Okay, so let's start with the idea that what is the effect of restudying on memory? Well, it just so happens that I have an experiment here that addresses that exact question. So in this particular experiment that was conducted by Roediger and Karpicki in 2006, essentially what they did is they gave their participants the same sorts of passages that you would find in like an SAT prep book, or if you've ever taken the TOEFL to establish your competency as an English speaker, you would have encountered these sorts of things. So they gave participants 256 to 275 word long passages about things like sea otters or the sun. And the reason why they chose these particular materials is the same reason that Ebbinghaus conducted his experiments using nonsense syllables, and that's that these topics were unusual enough that students weren't likely to have any pre-existing information in your memory about this sort of reading material, and so it was a pure measure of memory. Okay. So from these passages, they came up with 30 different concepts that students could extract from them, and they used this as the basis for their memory test. So if you were a participant in this experiment, you could have been placed in two different groups. So the first group would be handed the passage, and they would read that passage over and over and over again for 5 minutes. And then the experimenter would snatch up the passage and hand it to them again for another interval of 5 minutes. And they would again read the passage as many times as they could, carefully studying the passage. And so if you were in this group in red here, essentially what happened is you studied that same passage about the star or sea otters for 20 minutes total. Whereas if you were in the second group in blue here, you would study the passage for about 5 minutes, and then the experimenter would take the passage away, and they would give you a blank sheet of paper. And on this blank sheet of paper, you would write down all that you remembered about that particular passage. Okay, so whereas the people in the red group studied the passage for 20 minutes, right? The people in the blue group studied the passage for 5 minutes and then spent the remaining 15 minutes taking a test on it, right? And it was a free recall test, which means they just wrote down on this blank sheet of paper everything that they could remember about the passage over and over again for that entire 15-minute interval, and they weren't given any sort of feedback on what they remembered, right? So they just kept writing it down without knowing sort of how accurate they were or how many of those 30 concepts they had gotten. They just continually sort of were tested on this passage. And what the researchers did is they had 2 tests that they administered. So one was after 5 minutes and the other was after 1 week. So again, very similar to Ebbinghaus, we're looking at the effects of delays on memory performance, right? So we have an immediate test after 5 minutes and a delayed test after 1 week. And the way that the final test would work is, again, they would just be handed a blank sheet of paper and asked to write down as much of the passage as they could remember, as many ideas from the passage as they could remember. Okay, so let's look at the results. So in red here, again, we have our group that studied the passage for 20 minutes. And in blue, we have our group that studied the passage for 5 minutes and then took several successive free recall tests in the remaining 15-minute interval, right? So after 5 minutes on the immediate test, those who studied more remembered more, right? Which isn't all that surprising, right? They had 20 minutes to read over this passage over and over and over again. So it makes sense that at least initially, they would remember more of those 30 concepts than somebody who only had 5 minutes, a mere 5 minutes to read the same passage, right? So after 5 minutes, those who studied more remembered more, right? So what does that suggest for us? Well, it suggests that sometimes that rereading strategy might be effective, right? If you have a test that's coming up fairly soon, if there's not much of a delay, then simply rereading your notes or rereading your textbook chapter might actually help you. Right? But interestingly, if that delay extends to 1 week, we see the opposite pattern, right? So now, okay, so let's look at some results here. So first, let's take a look at what happened on the immediate test. So after 5 minutes, those who studied more remembered more, right? So those people in red who read the passage for 20 minutes, right? On the immediate test, they were able to recall 80% of those 30 concept questions, whereas those who only got to read the passage for 5 minutes remembered about 70% of the passage. So clearly after 5 minutes, those who were able to reread the passage more, right, profited from that in terms of their memory performance. However, interestingly, this pattern reverses after 1 week. So remember I said that those who studied the passage for 20 minutes initially, after 5 minutes, recalled 80% of the passage, right? Well, this number drops all the way down to 40% after a week, right? So it seems like there's not a whole lot of long-term retention of information going on, right? So if you have a test coming up very, very quickly, and you don't need to retain the information, then maybe just rereading something over and over again is going to be helpful, but that information is going to be forgotten very, very rapidly. You're not going to be able to hang on to that information in the long term. Versus studying something for 5 minutes and then completing several successive tests where you're actively retrieving the information, right? So the participants in blue who studied the passage for 5 minutes and then spent 15 minutes testing themselves, they initially, after 5 minutes, were able to recall about 70% of the passage. And even 1 week later, this recall percentage only drops to about 60%, right? So that is a 10% loss vice a 40% loss, right? So again, what this suggests is that if you only want to remember information for a very, very short time and you don't expect to ever need that information again, then it would be okay to simply reread your notes or the textbook chapter or sort of just passively listen to a lecture. But certainly for an exam or anything without a very, very short retention interval or a very, very short delay, this kind of passive studying is not going to be sufficient, right? So anytime you want to be able to recall information long term, it would be much more effective to test yourself. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to review a couple more pieces of evidence that support the notion that retrieval practice or testing yourself is going to allow you to better retain information long term than simply reading it or passively studying it. So in this experiment by Slameka and Graf, they had 2 groups of participants. So one group of participants simply read a list of related word pairs. So king, crown, horse, saddle, lamp, shade. And the second group of participants were given the first word and a couple letters from the second word, and they had to generate it themselves. And what they found is that when they were given a test later on, where they were given the first word and they had to come up with the second word, people in the generate condition recalled 28% more of the words than people in the read condition. So again, that's pretty compelling evidence that retrieving something rather than studying it is going to lead to superior memory for that information. Okay, the last experiment I wanted to share with you, it's kind of a fun experiment. So this was an experiment done with children. So Wheeler and Roediger conducted this experiment in which the kids were presented with 60 pictures while listening to a story, and the pictures were integrated into the story such that when an object was named in the story, the picture also appeared on screen. So there was a screen where they would see pictures as the story was read. And they were told that they would later be asked to recall all of the pictures and that paying attention to the story would help them remember them better. So after hearing the story and seeing all the pictures, the participants were given a free recall test, very similar to the last ones. They were given a blank sheet of paper and asked to recall as many of the names of the 60 pictures as possible. Okay. And after hearing the story and viewing all the pictures, there were 3 groups of participants. So in one group, they were just told to come back a week later. In another group, they were given 1 retrieval practice test. So right there, after viewing the story, they were given a blank sheet of paper and told to write down the names of as many of the pictures as they could remember. And in the last condition, they were given 3 tests, 3 consecutive tests, where they were given a blank sheet of paper, they wrote down all the pictures they could remember, they were given another blank sheet of paper, they wrote down all the pictures they could remember, etc. So it's very similar. So basically what is manipulated across groups is the number of intervening tests before the final test a week later. So we had 0 tests at the top, 1 test in the middle, and 3 tests on the bottom. And then after that, 1 week later, they all took another test, and it was the same test where they were handed a blank sheet of paper and they had to write down as many of the pictures as they could recall. And what the researchers found is that on that final test, that final free recall test, if you had 0 practice tests, you recalled on average about 17.4 pictures. If you had 1 initial test or 1 retrieval practice opportunity, you recalled 23.3 of the pictures. And if you had 3, you recalled 31.8 of the pictures, right? So right away we see very convincingly, right, that the more tests you take or the more opportunities that you're given to test yourself rather than simply studying the pictures, right, the better your future recall is going to be, and specifically your recall after a delay, right? So it seems that if you want to hold on to something long-term, retrieval practice is going to be your best strategy, as opposed to simply studying something. One of the other kind of neat benefits of testing or retrieval practice is something called test-potentiated learning, right? So another benefit of retrieval practice is that it can actually make learning easier during future study sessions. So a lot of research has shown that when students take a test and then restudy the material, they learn more from that restudy opportunity than they would if they restudied it without taking a test, right? So even taking a test before you restudy something is going to be helpful for you, right? So what that suggests is that if you break up your study time, right, and you study for 1 hour for 8 days instead of cramming for 8 hours straight, what you can do is study on day 1 for 1 hour, and then when you get to day 2, before you restudy the information, go ahead and do some retrieval practice, right? So maybe take out a stack of flashcards or try to fill in an outline from memory, or maybe have somebody else quiz you on your notes, because simply engaging in that retrieval practice is going to make your second or your second study opportunity or your restudy session much more effective. Okay, so again, the take-home message is whenever possible, you want to engage in active retrieval and generate information from memory rather than passively restudying it. So make flashcards, give yourself a practice test or a chapter quiz from your textbook. And like I said, you could even sketch out an outline using the chapter headings and subheadings. Read the chapter once and then fill in the content based on what you've read. That's going to give you not only a chance to create your own notes, but also to practice reading what you've, or practice retrieving what you've read in the chapter. Okay. So all of those opportunities are going to involve active retrieval from memory, which is going to result in better long-term retention of information. Okay, all right, so that concludes this video, and I will pick it up next with how to best schedule your study time. Okay, all right, I'll see you in my next video.